There's a moment in this story where you realize the PGA Tour didn't just beat Greg Norman. They beat him, buried the argument, and then, years later, did exactly what he'd been asking for all along. This is the story of how one of the most powerful institutions in golf proved its biggest critic right and made sure he never got the credit. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Norman represented in 1994. He wasn't a fringe voice. He wasn't some agent with a business plan. He was the most dominant golfer on the planet, world number one for 331 weeks across a decade, a two-time Open champion, three-time PGA Tour money leader. He was the first player in Tour history to surpass $10 million in career earnings. When Greg Norman spoke about professional golf, it carried weight. And what Norman kept coming back to was compensation. In 1994, the average winner's check at a standard PGA Tour event was around $216,000. And Norman believed the top players were drastically underpaid relative to what they brought to the sport. He believed golf had a global audience the tour wasn't reaching. And he believed the structure of professional golf needed to change. He was about to try to do something about it. On the 17th of November, 1994, at Sherwood Country Club in California, at his own Shark Shootout event, Norman went public with what he called the World Golf Tour. The plan was very specific: 8 limited field events featuring only the world's top 40 players, a total purse of $25 million across the series, with a first prize of $600,000 at each event, roughly double what the biggest regular tour events were paying. A $1 million bonus at the end of the year for the best player in the series, travel stipends, and the one thing the PGA Tour had never offered its players, a share of the television revenue. Fox Sports, backed by Rupert Murdoch, was on board to broadcast all of it. Norman claimed the TV deal alone was worth $112 million. The argument underneath all of it was straightforward. The best players in the world deserved to be compensated like the stars they were, and the game needed to grow beyond the American market. Look at what that proposal entailed: limited fields, elevated prize money, global events, and guaranteed player compensation. It's worth keeping that list in your head, because we're going to come back to it. Now, the reaction to Norman's idea was almost immediate. PGA Tour Commissioner Tim Finchem drew the line fast. Any player who competed in WGT events, he warned, would have to choose the World Golf Tour or the PGA Tour. There was no middle ground. Arnold Palmer, 65 years old and still the most respected voice in the room, stood up at the Shark Shootout and spoke against it. The press was worse. The Washington Post called the proposal brazen. One columnist wrote that Norman was making Al Bundy look classy. The word that followed Norman everywhere that week was greedy. And then the players who were supposed to be on his side folded. Norman had believed he had support. Nick Price, his close friend, and the world number one at the time, had expressed interest, but publicly, he went quiet. Paul Azinger later recalled what happened in the room. He said, "The guys that he thought were on board totally flipped on him right in front of all of us. We all said no." Norman even had envelopes slipped under hotel room doors at the Johnny Walker World Championship in Jamaica, asking top players to sign commitment agreements. Nick Faldo got one, opened it, and told reporters exactly what he thought. "What world tour? It's not going to happen. There is nothing concrete at all." The World Golf Tour never played a single event. Norman was left holding the idea alone, while the tour he'd challenged went right back to business as usual. But this is where the story gets interesting. 3 years later, in 1997, the PGA Tour announced the World Golf Championships, a new series of limited field, elevated purse events featuring the world's best players competing globally. Norman's name wasn't on the announcement. Nobody had called him, according to a Sports Illustrated report at the time. He was furious, and he confronted Fincham directly. His claim was that Fincham had privately promised to keep him involved if any World Tour concept moved forward. Instead, the tour had waited for Norman's version to collapse, then built its own. Mark O'Meara, who had been in the room for the 1994 presentation, summed it up plainly years later. Whether you like Greg Norman or you don't like Greg Norman, whether you like LIV or you don't like LIV, he had some good ideas. To be fair, he knew golf was going to be a global game. To be fair, the World Golf Championships were his idea. Then, in 2021, Norman became the CEO of LIV Golf, a Saudi-backed rival golf league built around everything the World Golf Tour had originally proposed. Big purses, global events, no-cut format, guaranteed earnings for every player in the field. And this time, the money was real enough to move players. Phil Mickelson, Dustin Johnson, Brooks Koepka, Bryson DeChambeau, Sergio Garcia, they all went. And the reaction from the PGA Tour? Nearly identical to 1994. Greedy, bad for the game, disloyal were the type of words being thrown around. Rory McIlroy in 2022 said, "I hate what it's doing to the game of golf. I hate it. I really do." Tiger Woods was critical of the players who left the PGA Tour too. And the tour? It suspended anyone who played a LIV event. In 1994, the tour had beaten Norman by doing nothing. No rule changes, no payment increases, no concessions. They just applied pressure until the players walked away. That strategy had worked perfectly back then. But LIV wasn't asking players to take a leap of faith. It was handing them checks, and the PGA Tour couldn't pressure its way out of that. Once LIV started pulling real stars with real money, the PGA Tour moved faster than it had moved on player compensation in decades. For the 2022-23 season, the Tour launched the Earnings Assurance Program, guaranteeing every fully exempt player who competed in 15 or more events a minimum of $500,000. Guaranteed money on the PGA Tour, the same concept that had been called greedy when Norman proposed it. They also introduced what became known as elevated or designated events, basically limited field tournaments featuring the tour's top players, with payments between $20 and $25 million. The Players' Championship that year carried a $25 million purse. In 1994, Norman had proposed $600,000 first prizes and been called a greedy disruptor. By the end of the 2022-23 season, 139 PGA Tour players had earned over $1 million, a new record. The rising tide Norman had argued for 3 decades earlier had finally arrived. It had just taken the threat of a rival league to make it happen. The tour's own CEO eventually said it out loud. Brian Rowlap, who took over as PGA Tour CEO in 2025, appeared on the Pat McAfee show and acknowledged that LIV had exposed some things that the PGA Tour could do better. Things like how it worked for fans, for television partners, and specifically for players. Here's the honest version of this story. Norman's 1994 proposal had real problems. It was announced before venues were secured. Players were approached through hotel room envelopes, not real conversations. The execution was hasty, and the player consensus he thought he had turned out not to exist, so the tour's criticism wasn't entirely manufactured. And Norman was not a neutral figure either. He stood to benefit enormously from a world tour built around the game's biggest stars, as he was one of them. The self-interest was real, even if the argument was also right. But the PGA Tour crushed it because the argument was threatening to them. Then, when a better-funded version of the same argument came along 30 years later, the tour finally had to do what Norman had been asking. Norman's own words on the whole thing were this: "The thing that bothers me the most about it is the perception that I was trying to destroy the PGA Tour. That is the total opposite." Greg Norman didn't win, not in 1994, and not with LIV. He left his role as CEO of LIV in late 2024, and LIV itself is now facing questions about its own future. But here's what's also true. The PGA Tour that exists today looks a lot more like what Norman had described 30 years ago. The players are better compensated. The biggest events feature the best players. The model Norman got destroyed for proposing is now just how professional golf works. He didn't get to stand up and say he told them so. The tour made sure of that. But the sport moved in the direction he pointed, and the players who stayed on tour are better off because of a fight that Norman started, whether they want to admit it or not. That's a complicated thing to sit with, but it's the honest version of his legacy.